Here and on Zoom. Welcome back for our 31st year of the workshop in the history of material text. And it's great to be back with you all in the Kislak Center and on Zoom. The chat is open up for you on Zoom, and as always, you can leave any questions in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function to ask your question live during Q&A. I'm Zach Lesser in the English department, and I run the workshop along with John Pollack of the Kislak Center, Jerry Singerman, Humanities Editor Emeritus from the Penn Press, and we are welcoming our new Bristol Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Text, Lila Goldenberg. Lila's already done a ton of work for this year. She's a PhD candidate in history here, where she also has the title of Sarah Mitchell Fellow for the Study of European History, so she's multi-titled already. Her own work focuses on hybrid books, that is codices including manuscript and print, and we'll get to learn more about her research when she presents the workshop this spring. So welcome and thank you both in advance and already in retrospect for all the work you're doing. And as always, we're passing around our sign-in sheet. If you would like to be on the mailing list and you're not yet on our listserv, just add your email. You'll get 1 or 2 emails from us each week just telling you about the upcoming talks. You can also sign up for our listserv through our website, penmaterialtext.org. You can find the semester's schedule there, along with a searchable database of all our talks going back to 1996. Next week, we'll have Damon McCool from Eastern State Penitentiary. I'm talking about printing in prison, project he's been working on with our own Whitney Tritine to trace the history of printing at Eastern State. So I hope you'll join us next week for that talk as well. Okay, announcements before we get started. John, you want to say something about this brochure?
Nice to see everybody and welcome back. There might be a few faces in this crowd or in the electronic crowd that are, or to whom the new Kislak Center is new or new-ish. So we've just sent around our fall brochure of events, and obviously material text is a centerpiece of this department's activities every week, but there are other things as well, including a wonderful concert this Thursday, public lectures, exhibitions, and other presentations, physical and virtual. I won't go through them all, but it is also useful for me to deputize you all as missionaries to get the word out. Invite all of these are public completely. Pass the word to your students. We're particularly eagerly trying always to get younger students, new graduate students, undergraduates to come to these things rather than feeling like this is a place where they can't come. So we could use your help with that. For those of you online, the full events for the semester are easily available through the library's homepage, library.upenn.edu, and you can be in touch with me or my colleagues if you have any questions, and it's great to have you here, even with some Geniza fragments on the table.
Okay. Any other pressing announcements from anyone in the workshop? Okay. Well, I'm really happy to welcome back Marina Rustow to the workshop to kick off our semester. She last spoke to us in 2016 about the Cairo Geniza, the storehouse of about 400,000 pages spanning from the 6th to the 19th century, on which she's one of the foremost experts. She is the Khedouri Zilkha Professor of Jewish Civilization in the Near East at Princeton University, where she also directs the Geniza Lab, which brings undergrads, grads, and postdocs together to research documents from the Geniza, to reconstruct them digitally from fragments located in different parts of the world, to transcribe and translate them. Their website is geniza.princeton.edu, and it's a fun site to play around with. Opium, stomach problems, bed bugs, pirates, taxes, it's all there. Marina's first book was Heresy and the Politics of Community, The Jews of the Fatimid Caliphate, 2008 from Cornell, which used the Genizan documents to greatly expand the sources for studying Jewish communal life, and thereby transforming our understanding of Jewish community, heresy, and the power struggles between the two major Jewish sects in the Islamic Caliphate. More recently, she published The Lost Archive, Traces of a Caliphate in a Cairo Synagogue, published by Princeton in 2020, which won the Haskins Medal from the Medieval Academy. Along the way, she's won a MacArthur Genius Award in 2015, a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2014, an NEH Collaborative Fellowship, a couple of ACLS fellowships, the Rome Prize, et cetera, et cetera. The point is, Marina is not only one of the leading scholars of medieval studies and of Jewish studies, but she's also one of our most insightful and exciting interpreters of the material text. And so it's a great pleasure to start our year of workshops with her presentation on a subject that's also near and dear to this workshop and to its founder, Peter Stalybras, and is the kind of really boring topic that we love, which is bureaucratic file storage. So please join me in welcoming Marina.
Thank you so much, Zach. It's so great to be here because this seminar completely changed my field, actually. I mean, the study of the material text was a thing that used to happen only here, and then it started happening elsewhere. And if it weren't for you guys, my field would not be as interesting as it's become. So it's really wonderful to be here. Okay, so I'm going to be talking to you about holes. But before I start talking to you about holes, I'm going to talk to you, I'm just going to give you a little bit of like the context of where we are, where these documents come from that I'm going to be talking about. So this is the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Cairo. It was originally built sometime in the 11th century, and what you're looking at is mostly a 19th century reconstruction. It was totally rebuilt from the ground up, and it was in the process of rebuilding that a chamber was discovered that contained the 400,000 pages or fragments of pages that Zach referred to in his intro. And so just to give you kind of like the basic fact sheet, most of what was found in the Geniza dates to between 950 and 1250, which is really great because it's otherwise a very poorly documented period for Jews in the Islamic world and also for social history. So a lot of good stuff that we didn't know before. And about 90% of what was found in the Geniza are texts that were meant for posterity. And I'm putting books in quotation marks for reasons that I don't have to explain to this seminar. The codex was very, I mean, this was really a world of the codex on the one hand, but lest you picture Geniza full of fragments of luxury scribal editions, in fact, those are precisely the books that tended to get repaired and transmitted. And there were some of those that were found in the Geniza, some of which have been lovingly and painstakingly reconstructed by scholars, some very recently, based on the fragments that were preserved. But what abounds from the Geniza are cheap books, what my colleague Judith Olszewicz-Langer calls cheap books. So what you're looking at here is a rotulus containing lots and lots of liturgical poetry in Hebrew, copies of it, written on the back of two documents, one in Arabic and one in Judeo-Arabic. The Arabic document is a memorandum of state, so an official state document. That's the really long one. And the shorter one at the top is a trade letter of traders who traded across the Indian Ocean. And that's typical. The kind of recycling situation that you have in the Geniza is always really fun to try to figure out, like, how did these things actually get from point A to point B? So that's one form of informally produced and especially user-produced copies of books that you have from the Geniza. Another form is the quire. So quires that did not get bound into codices. This is a quire consisting of 10 bifolios nested together, so it's a pretty fat quire, single quire. It's in Arabic script, and it's some kind of an administrative manual from late 11th century Palestine that some colleagues of mine have been working the last word on cheap books from the Geniza, Judith Elshobe-Schlanger, who I mentioned before. I just want to give a shout out to her article, which was kind of a game changer, because she was the one who was taking these non-luxury editions really, really seriously and saying, you know, hey guys, we have like a unparalleled opportunity to talk about how like normal people were copying books for themselves, as opposed to wealthy people who are commissioning scribes to write books for them professionally. Equally precious for the likes of me, because I'm a social historian, are the documents. So the other 10% of what was in the Geniza are documentary texts, legal deeds, letters, lists, accounts, and so forth. So this is a letter that was sent by a Libyan Jew in 1103 to his brother back home. He happened to be traveling down the Red Sea on his way to India, and he was scared crapless because they had just put him in a boat that didn't have any iron nails, which is typical of Indian Ocean boat construction in this period. Boats were tied together with coconut wire ropes, but he didn't know that, and so he had no idea if he was going to make it. It's, yeah, bed bugs, basically, as Zach said. It's good stuff. Okay, so that's kind of to give you the contents. The geographic reach of what was in the Geniza is kind of staggering. I mean, much more than I myself was even prepared for a few years ago, when I discovered that there was a robust community of Jews in Sumatra in the 13th century. So it's, you know, the surprises basically just keep coming. Despite the cache having been found in Egypt. In the main period that the Geniza covers, Egypt was in the midst of kind of a renaissance. First of all, Egypt was being ruled from Egypt for the first time since there were pharaohs, because of a dynasty called the Fatimids, who had arisen in Central North Africa in 909 and eventually conquered Egypt in 969, and ruled from Cairo, which they founded, for 2 centuries. So the Fatimids were very conscious of the wealth of Egypt, the centrality of Egypt for trade networks across the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, and they did their best to cultivate trade during this period. They in fact did cultivate trade quite successfully. Under the Fatimids, the twin cities of Fustat and Cairo, which were technically separate cities in this period, grew to an estimated 500,000 people, which is quite enormous for the period. But the vast majority of the population who lived there lived in Fustat, so the urban medieval core of the city of Cairo. Which is in fact where the Ben Ezra Geniza was located and still is located. You can visit the synagogue today. In fact, they just did another renovation and it reopened a week ago. So it's very much visitable, whereas it hasn't been for a little while. The fragments aren't there anymore. They are divided now across 60 or 70 libraries and private collections. So working on them is kind of like a data job, which is part of the reason why I run the database that Zach was talking about. So the world of the Fatimids was very much a Mediterranean world. When they arose in the early 10th century, they controlled the areas in green, whereas their rivals, the Abbasids, controlled what's in blue or lavender, whatever you want to call that color. But by the time they conquered Egypt, the world looked more like this. So they were very much central players in the history of the Mediterranean, and a central node, kind of the hinge between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, which explains their economic success. So the Fatimids have enjoyed more attention over the last 30 years than at any time since the fall of the dynasty in 1171, in part because of manuscripts that have become available for study, and also because of the Institute for Ismaili Studies in London, which has done a lot to get texts edited and published. But one thing that people hadn't tried very hard to do was to understand how the Fatimid state actually ruled. So we have, this is like typical of Islamic history, we have long form texts galore preserved in mosque and private libraries, some of them in the Fatimids case written by the Caliphate's many Sunni detractors because the Fatimids were Shi'i, other texts written by those deep within the Fatimid movement. And the long form texts are preponderantly philosophy, theology, exegesis, homiletics. Most of it is still in manuscript or has been published for the first time recently. So what was missing from the picture was the day-to-day administrative documentation that the Fatimids produced, which actually explains a lot about how they were able to accomplish this economic miracle. But it turns out that the Cairo Geniza was actually teeming with Fatimid state documents. It's just that many of them had been recycled for Hebrew script texts. So most of the documents preserved in the Geniza are in Hebrew script. Some are in Arabic script, but still others are Arabic documents that were reused for Hebrew script texts, like the ones that I'm showing you now. These, in fact, are all fragments of Fatimid decrees, and you can tell that they're decrees because the Arabic text is ginormous and has a lot of blank space between the lines, which is also precisely what makes them vulnerable to reuse. For Fatimid state documents, there were two pioneers in the field, S.M. Stern, who died in 1969, and Jeffrey Kahn, who is very much still among us. I came relatively late to this very small party. These documents became a massive rabbit hole for me starting in about 2008. And like most Geniza rabbit holes, it proved to be too big for just one scholar. So I've now managed to persuade colleagues of the importance of Fatimid state documents, and I've trained some students to use them as well. So much more fun to work in company. So in 2020, when I published this book, I tried to do a couple things. I tried to give a kind of general overview of the system of Fatimid state documentation. I tried to make it accessible to non-specialists. I tried to put at least one paragraph in every chapter that you wouldn't typically find in an academic monograph, except for chapter 8, which is a bit dense. So I'm just giving you warning. So I'm going to offer you one like micro argument from the book. And then before your very eyes, I'm going to perform public penance for an oversight. I'm sure there was more than one oversight in the book, but this one actually gets me really excited. And so I wanted to present it here. So it's very much work in progress. Okay, so here's the micro argument. This is a fragment of a Fatimid decree. I don't even have to tell you that because you already know. You can see the wide line spacing and the very large Arabic text. They're typically rotally, or at least the public versions of Fatimid decrees are rotally. In fact, this is 7 fragments of a decree from 3 different Geniza collections on 2 continents. The join was a tour de force, not by me, but by my colleague, Ronnie Shweka. And the reason he was able to actually join these fragments is that he was looking for the Hebrew/Aramaic text on the verso. So he had a much greater density of text to work with. I myself could never have done this. And so he calls me over from his corner of the library. We were both on fellowship at Oxford at the time. And he said, there's Arabic on the back. Can you tell me what this is? And I said, my God, you just found me 1.23 meters of a Fatimid decree, which is a lot more than I had before I only had small fragments. So in chapter 14 of my book, I trace the life cycle of this document from its production in the Fatimid Chancery at Cairo through its arrival in the office of a lower official who, when he was finished with it, may have sold it as scrap paper, whereupon it was reused by a congregational rabbi with a longstanding habit of reusing state documents to write out his sermons. And also generally stealing texts from pre-existing works. And then it spent more than 900 years in the limbo of the Ben Ezra Geniza chamber before its fragments were finally dispersed in the 19th century. So as a document, the Fatimid decree is quite grand. This is only 1.23 meters of it. And based on the usual diplomatics and flow of the Fatimid decree, I'd estimate that this one was several meters long, if not, double digits. So its grandeur made it an excellent instrument for the chancery to kind of perform the grandeur of the caliph, right? This is a sort of avatar of the caliph himself. It's an instance of what Tamar Alethi has called the sovereign privilege of waste. But its grandeur also had 2 other implications. One is, as I mentioned before, it was vulnerable to reuse, what with the blank verso and all the space between the lines. And second, it was wildly impractical for long-term storage. Hence, the lower official possibly selling it off for scrap. This too is a Fatimid decree, but unlike the Grand Rotulus I just showed you, it's compact and sensible. It's a bifolio that measures 25 by 17 centimeters. And so you have the first page on the left and the last page on the right. And here is the middle, pages 2 and 3. And to compare the two, just to give you a sense of the relative sizes, I put them at scale side by side on this slide. The bifolio decree was intended for archival storage. It was discovered twice, once by S.M. Stern, who never published it, but who left a transcription in his nachlass that basically just sat there for 50 years. And then I was like bowled over when I found it. I was like, oh, so he transcribed it too? And then it was discovered again by Jeffrey Kahn, who published it twice, once in 1986, and then again in 1993. So Kahn was very much aware that this was a decree from the Fatimid archives, but there was more to be said about it. We know that it's a copy because it says so, and it says so in two different ways. So the bit that I've outlined in purple, nuskhatuhu, says it's copy, but the Arabic word nuskha doesn't necessarily mean that it was copied from something. It means that it's a kind of textual exemplar, right? So we use the word copy in that same ambiguous sense. In green, it says it has been copied, and the verb there is different. It's a verb that means to transfer the text from one support to another, like to make a copy from something onto something else. That little word that I've outlined in green, which kind of like extends down the length of the page, it took 3 Arabic paleographers 35 years to decipher. It was brutally hard to read, and it was, in the end, it was Frédéric Baudin who nailed it. So it doesn't say what these two ways of saying this has been copied doesn't say is whether the text on this bifolio was copied from the rotulus or the other way around, okay? We do know, though, that it was intended for the archive. And one of the ways that this emerges is what's outlined in blue, a summary of the decree's contents in a component of the document that in Arabic is called the bitaqa, from Greek petakion, which means a note, a ticket, or a tag. So it's cognate with the Hebrew word petek and with the Syriac pitka, but ultimately the word is Greek. So in this particular case, this bitaqa, or this note or ticket or tag, it's an archival labeling technique. In this case, it's not a separate slip of paper, but rather a notation that's made directly on the bifolio. Making this notation in the upper corner would permit the Chancery archivists to know what was in the text without actually having to read the entire thing or even having to open the bifolio. So it's a filing aid. Okay, so back to the wacky little text that I've outlined in green. Together with Jeffrey Kahn, before I wrote The Lost Archive, I assumed that it has been copied meant that the text on the bifolio was copied from the Grand Rotulus, right? That it was copied for the purposes of storage in the archive. So you have the Grand Rotulus, and then you're like, well, gosh, we can't store that. It's just too massive. So let's make a small copy of it. But actually, what I realized in writing the book is that it means the converse. The Rotulus copy, or copies, because probably there was more than one, were made from the text on this bifolio, which is the canonical text of the decree. And that, in fact, is what the text that I've outlined in purple means. Its copy means its text, right? The text as it's supposed to go out to the lower officials or into the territory, depending on the use of the decree. So I realized this only once I went back and reread the only description of the Fatimid chancery that survives from the Fatimid period, which basically says exactly as much, only I didn't get it until I thought about the physical documents. So the official responsible for producing the final texts of decrees, who actually has a name in this chancery manual, finishes writing out the text, and that's in fact what's on the bifolio. And then he passes it on to a dedicated calligrapher, okay? So the calligrapher whose sole task is to write out those grand rotuli. So the calligrapher writes out the rotulus then gets sent out to lower officials or into the territory, and at that point, the bifolio gets archived. That seems to be the workflow. This was a scenario that I didn't expect, and it has implications for the ecology of documents in the Fatimid realm, because even though the rotulus seems so impressive to us, and it must have seemed impressive to people back then, it wouldn't have been considered worthy of archiving. It was an instrument of performance. So in the book, I compare this to Pete Townshend's guitar. Any Who fans out there? I told you, like, I try to put things in the book that you don't normally find in academic monographs. But it was kind of like the answer to the question at the origins of my book, which is, if the grand Fatimid decrees are so wasteful and impressive and important looking, then why were so many of them shredded and reused as scrap paper? So the answer that I put forward is that once the grand decrees were delivered or publicly performed, they actually had no more inherent value. For long-term storage, it was actually the bifolio that was the text of record, whereas the grand rotulist was a mere avatar. Okay, so having figured that out, the next question was, well, how did the archivist actually file these documents, like physically? How might the Fatimid archive have looked? And I don't have a good answer to this question, but I feel like I need to keep like digging into it. So now we get to the mistake for which I'm going to do penance. Okay, so this is a passage from the only description of the Fatimid chancery that we have that was written during the Fatimid period. It was written by the head of the Fatimid chancery in 1130, a guy named Ibn Sayrafi, which also happens to be precisely the period from which this bifolio decree is from. So this is where Ibn Sayrafi describes the archiving system in the chancery. I basically just told you what it says using the cartoons on the previous slides, but I want to focus your attention on the word in pink. He says, when the chancery document composer or the official in charge of diplomatic correspondence has written a document, he hands it over to the clerk in charge of copying, who makes a copy of it letter for letter. At the top, he writes exemplar, nuskha, of such and such a document going out at such and such a time, giving the date, day, month, and year. The archivist then takes it and files it. So the verb here is shakka, together with similar items in the file. The file is also called a shakka for that year. The archivist puts together everything of the same type, keeping each year separate, divided into 12 sections, each month included in a separate file, a shakka, so that if he looks for anything, he finds it with the least effort. So what's curious, and by the way, what's in the ellipsis is basically he's saying the same thing again, but he's saying it about the official responsible for writing decrees. So we know this is also the workflow for decrees. So the word Ibn Sayrafi uses for file, both the noun and the verb, shakka, means to pierce or to impale. So lest you worry about the safety of the archivist, we're not talking about impalement with a lance, but piercing files, perhaps with an awl, perhaps a spike, or perhaps a needle. Okay, but how? So Khan had a theory about this. Khan wrote about this bifolio that careful examination of the sheet reveals perforations along the fold, which indicate that it was originally bound up with other leaves in a codex. So what Khan is envisioning is archiving in codices, nested bifolios or quires sewn together at the folds. So I think what was pulling him in that direction was long-form sources describing archiving in the chancery, not of Fatimid Cairo, but of Abbasid Baghdad. So it was a reasonable assumption to have made, but I'm not sure that it was correct. It's true that the Fatimids took some important elements of chancery practice from the Abbasids, but archiving wasn't necessarily one of them. So in the book, I take a little bit more of an agnostic approach. I say the one archival copy of a decree that survived, measures 17 by 25, folded down the middle of the short with 4 pinholes at the fold, those were the ones that Khan had observed, where the archivist bound it into the file for that month and year. So I'm trying to be a little bit more agnostic by saying, by not assuming codices, but assuming some kind of bound file. Okay, which is more or less what Ibn Sayrafi says, but I don't get more specific than that. As often happens, conservators have actually eliminated some of the evidence here. There do seem to have been holes at the centerfolds. It's not clear how big those holes might have been. They are now very, very tiny indeed. So, okay, here's the duh moment, the penance. Perhaps you've already noticed this, in which case you're way ahead of me because I didn't notice it until after the book came out, which is those aren't the only holes on the page. There are also these holes. And it turns out that these holes are suspiciously symmetrical. They are each 6 centimeters away from the centerfold, which suggests that the bifolio was actually pierced in its folded state. Cambridge puts their digital images against a blue background in post-processing to facilitate detection by cropping algorithms. So like if you're doing PowerPoint, it's really easy to just crop out the blue because it contrasts with the kind of beige of the fragment itself. But I'm going to now give you the same manuscript without the background cropped out, just so that you can kind of see a little bit better what's going on. So you can see that the holes are not quite the same size. But actually, I'm going to blow this up like crazy, you can see that actually that's also just conservation, right? The conservators have kind of ironed this out a little bit. So it looks like the hole is smaller than it in fact is. But we're talking about 2 pretty large size holes. Okay, big deal. There are a lot of Geniza fragments with holes, which is precisely why I ignored these for so long. In fact, I've rarely seen a Geniza fragment without a hole. But behold an image that I published in the book, but did not grasp the significance of for this problem until after the book came out. This is an early 14th century manuscript. There are 3 different illustrators. They're all wonderful. I highly recommend having a look at this, if nothing else, for the awesome headgear. But in this particular image, you have the sovereign, doesn't matter which one, surrounded by officials and envoys, and there does seem to be some kind of a scribe here who is writing out one of these long rotulus style decrees. And he also appears to be copying what he's copying from a text that is in a bifolio that appears to be pierced through with a string. So there's his pen box and his inkwell. There is what I'm calling the archival version of the decree. These are separate stacked bifolios. There's the string, and there are the holes that is connecting them together. Okay, so what does it all mean? I wish I knew. Okay, so now what Ibn Sayrafi says about how the archivist of the Chancery files documents gets really interesting, because this bifolio has in fact been impaled. The only other description we have of archiving in the Chancery comes from a different author, a certain Abu al-Fadl as-Suri, who we don't know anything about. We know that he's probably a 12th century guy. We only have snippets of his work as preserved in a massive multi-volume compendium of Chancery practice by a Mamluk Chancery official, so 15th century, named Zilkha. And this is what as-Suri says. Sorry, I just can't actually see the beginning of this text. So something. Oh, there we go. The archivist of the Chancery collects the incoming correspondence and other documents concerned with each district of the realm and makes a bundle, idbara, for each month into which he collects the documents concerning the people from that district. He affixes a label, bitaqa, there it is again, to it, on which he writes something to the effect of a bundle of the correspondence received from such and such province in such and such a month. Then he collects those bundles and puts them in a single bundle for that month and writes a label on it to that effect, so that there may be extracted from it what one wants to extract from it. So these are very similar descriptions, but they use different words. So while Ibn Sayrafi talks about piercing the archive document, as-Suri uses a different term that points in a similar but not identical direction, which is idbara, which means a bundle from the root dabara, to gather or to tie together. So this suggests that the pages are in fact tied in a bundle, not necessarily pierced and sewn. And on this slide, I've just offered you a more literal translation, where instead of saying file, I say actually piercing, or pierces and bundles, or a bundle. There may in fact have been 2 distinct methods of filing, piercing and bundling, in the Fatimid Chancery. Either way, there was certainly string involved. One method might have been for active documents, one for inactive documents, although it's not clear to me which would have been which. One thing that we don't have is an intact, complete file, let alone a series of them or description of the room in which they were housed, partly because if you read Ibn Sayrafi's description of the Fatimid Chancery, he says there should be a copy of this work in the Chancery at all times, meaning if you're reading it, you're already in the Chancery, so you don't need a description of it. So we don't know physically what it looked like. So in my desperation to try and envision how this all worked physically, I tried to draw on some analogs. This is a file from the Archivio di Stato in Genova from the year 1542. Note the thread passing into the papers, in Latin, a filum, which is related etymologically to our word file. They're bifolios. There's a thread through the middle of the pages, but it also looks as though they're bound together at the folds, and then there's some extra string in the back. So this appears to be a file that's pierced and bundled and bound. It's a kind of belt and suspenders approach to keeping all this stuff together. So at this point in the talk, what I was going to do is I was going to show you the OED entry for file. But then last night at about 11 p.m., I opened a fantastic email from Peter Stalybras, who sent me this article that he had written with Heather Wolf, in which they do something much better, which is they've consulted early modern lexicons for English and Dutch, and in a characteristically delightful fashion, they muster examples of both archival examples and also painterly examples of this kind of, precisely this kind of filing, and also not precisely this kind of filing. So here is one of the main examples that they muster, this painting from the 16th century in which documents appear to be nailed to the wall. So, right, talk about nailing stuff to the wall. Another derivative of the Latin filum is the Italian filza. In modern Italian archival practice, filza means file, but in earlier usage, the filza was actually something much more specific, which the English term apparently for this is a stitched pile, although pile is not etymologically related to filum. And this is an observation that I owe to Claudia Collini, who referred me to the archive of the Banco di Napoli, where these photos were taken by various contributors to TripAdvisor, who were very, very satisfied with their visit to the Archivio Storico del Banco di Napoli, which I myself have not yet visited, but they all raved about it. And you can see that these are, sorry?
You can see why they raved.
You can see why they raved about it. I mean, how cool is that? So Dr. Collini also brought to my attention this book by Laurie Neusdorfer at Wesleyan, who points out that in Genova and Tuscany, scribes actually preferred the filza to the codex as a method of filing, presumably because it was less finite, right? You could always add things to the end of the string. So there's her book. And here's a different view of the same kind of phenomenon. And here's another TripAdvisor photo. So it's interesting that in this photo in particular, you can see at least three methods of archival storage. You can see the loose folios pierced and threaded like a necklace. You can see bundles tied with string, and you can see codices. So it may well be that the Fatimid Chancery also had various methods of archiving that it used simultaneously. It is also possible that this bifolio, that Jeffrey Kahn was right, that you have holes in the centerfold that indicate that it might have been bound into a codex at some point, before which perhaps it was loosely bound together with this string through the middle technique. So, okay, so much for the analogs from other parts of the world, although I would beg you, if you yourselves have any, to send them to me, because I would very much like to see other analogs. So I then asked myself, and with this I will, this is my last point before I wrap up. I then asked myself, well, are there any analogs from my part of the world? And it turns out that there are. Okay, this is an itemized list of rental income for a Sufi khanqa, which is like an ashram for Sufis, from 14th century Jerusalem. So you can see that the accounts are arranged on a bifolio folded the long way, which was a remarkably persistent structure for keeping accounts, not only in the medieval Middle East, but also in Europe. A fact that I learned in this very room from a throwaway remark somebody made in this seminar. You can also see that there is string, right? So you're looking at the recto and the verso. The bifolio has become unbound from its companion, so it's not completely clear exactly what the string was doing. And I should also say there was string, because sadly the newer digital images of this document no longer have the string attached. So it's a case where having no strings attached is a bad thing. Again, it's the conservators doing their job, but perhaps a little bit too well. Here's another example from my part of the world. These are also private accounts, this time of a produce vendor in Damascus in the mid-13th century. And you can see the telltale symmetrical holes there as well. So both of these accounts are different from the Fatimid state decree in two ways. They're folded the long way rather than the short way, and they're private accounts rather than state documents. The format, both of these formats are called in various sources by the Arabic term daftar, which is also derived from the Greek diphthera, probably via Syriac. And so I asked myself, how common was the daftar among the Hebrew script documents that are much more abundant in the Geniza? And the answer is pretty common. I'm not the first to notice how common the daftar is for accounts, but I'm apparently the first to notice how many daftars have holes that are suspiciously symmetrical across the fold. I just want to, before I start running through these, just issue a giant caveat, which is I haven't physically, I'm working from digital images for the next few slides, so I haven't actually been able to measure the holes, so this is preliminary, but this is what I'm seeing so far. So this is an 11th century account in Judeo-Arabic for a partnership trading flax and silk. So I'm showing you recto and verso, and you can see the holes symmetrical across the fold. This is also an 11th century account from, in this case, an unknown trader. And this time you have two sets of holes, which suggests that these accounts probably weren't nailed to the wall. They might have been kept temporarily on double spikes. I wonder if the spikes were fixed. So in trying to answer the question, were there fixed spikes like you have, bill spikes in restaurants from before everything was digital? Or were people kind of ad hoc, like sewing these things together with thread? I thought, well, the only way to really answer this question is to find a number of accounts from the same trader and measure the holes. And so luckily we have this guy, Nahr ibn Nisim, who's an 11th century trader of great fame and fortune in his day, who left an archive of about 700 fragments in the Geniza. It's mostly incoming correspondence. The letters do not have holes, but the accounts, some of them do. However, the holes on the accounts are different distances apart based on measurements that I did digitally. So this has to be checked in person. So I conclude from this is all the same guy, this, and this, that we're not, in fact, talking about fixed spikes. And if not, then we're probably talking about threaded bifolios. Here's another one of his. Okay, so just in the interest of time, I'm going to skip these, which are kind of more of the same. And I did just want to show you this. So this is another Fatimid state document intended for archives. It's a pay register for the Armenian regiment of the Fatimid army. It's exactly the same size as the decree bifolio that I showed you, which I find interesting because paper didn't come in standard sizes, but there does seem to have been an effort to use a standard size for state archiving purposes. And this one, again, has the double holes rather than the single hole that we had on the decree that I was talking about earlier. And finally, just to really complicate things, this is also a state archival document of which we know there was another page somewhere because the account should have continued. It's supposed to be for 5 villages and we only have 2 here. And yet there are no holes. So there apparently wasn't a way of binding this to its companion bifolio. So just to sort of complicate the picture. This, I have no idea what it is because I haven't deciphered it yet, but it's got a string through it, so I had to show it. Okay, and then let me draw some conclusions now. So one, the notarial practice that has been abundantly attested for late medieval Italy and then for early modern England had some robust precedent in Egyptian practice. I think Egypt may be, in fact, significant as the locus of this practice because Egypt was a major center of textile production. Okay, textile production, sewing. So I didn't really start going in a textile direction until I was looking at the website of this exhibition that I missed at the Bard Graduate Center in 2018 called The Codex and Crafts in Late Antiquity, which makes excellent points like a multi-gathering codex, the precursor of today's bound book, is a complex object with many parts that work together and so forth. And makers of codices adapted a number of existing craft techniques, among them sewing techniques for the edges of textiles and mats, and then for leather covers, similar techniques for what's used in making shoes. And there are some like really great graphics on the BGC website that you can see where they have these like, you know, cute like images of how these things actually were sewn or woven together, how you actually make a codex using some of these weaving techniques. So satisfying to watch. I could watch this all day. And then there are actually some textiles that survive that use similar techniques. So this is called the sprang technique, which we actually still have today. It's convenient, right? These things expand. So I started thinking about the relationship between documents and textiles. So sewing documents as a means of archiving. It's significant that some of the merchants whose accounts I was showing you are primarily trading in textiles, especially flax, raw flax, but also finished linen textiles and silk. The techniques that scribes use may have also been shared with weaving, hemming, and mending, but certainly the ones who are binding the books are sharing those techniques. There's also a phenomenon in the Islamic world of sewing document waste into garments, especially accounts. So this is a wonderful example that is at the Met. It's the inner lining of a silk cap. These are Fatimid tax receipts and fiscal accounts. They have dates on them, and this is what the cap looks like. So this was like, you know, again, the conservators really went crazy with this, but it's still kind of great to be able to actually read the text. So when this came to them, this was all one object. You can read more on this in this wonderful article that just came out by Boris Liebrands called Talking Hats. Then there's also the mistara, the object that was used to rule, that scribes used to rule texts, which is made of stacked glued paper, i.e. cardboard, and string that's sewn through it. So a couple of these mistaras have survived in the Geniza. Here's one. There's a manuscript that's actually written with the use of a mistara. Here's another fragmentary one that's made of a recycled medical text. And the string is still attached there as well. And then finally, I just want to kind of point out the obvious, which is that paper was made actually out of recycled textiles. So that's where I am in my thinking on this. I'm very, very eager to hear any comparisons, analogies, and comments you might have.
Okay, so we're open for questions if Peter doesn't take the first half hour of question time, because I'm sure he has a lot he wants to say. So questions in the room or on Zoom, if you want to use raise hand. You know, anyone who's ever been in an Italian butcher shop can tell you why they like to use the format of the filza, because it's like a giant sausage hanging from the ceiling. Jerry.
Thank you. This was Just a factual question that I have this. The archival bifold survives also in the Geniza, or?
Yes.
Do you have any theories as to how that got there and why?
I mean, theories. So we know that there were Jews who worked in high state offices. The other thing is that everything that I like, when I tried to gather as much evidence as I could, both physical and textual, of how the Fatimid archives worked, it seemed that they pruned regularly. Now, at what point that would have been pruned, I have no idea. But it was. I think that for me, the penny dropped when I was talking to a grad student, no longer grad student, at Princeton, Anna Dolganov, who wrote on archiving in Roman Egypt. And in her world, things were very, very different from my world. In Roman Egypt, they wanted everything in triplicate. And she found this great papyrus where the archivist of the Arsinoite nome is complaining to his boss and saying, when I got here, there were things all over the floor. There were like mouse droppings, insects are eating the stuff. There was no order. It was complete chaos. So the Romans seemed to want to have a lot of copies of a lot of things, and it was a problem for them. The Fatimids jettisoned regularly, and they seemed to have run a pretty tight ship when it came to archiving. They didn't like to keep things in triplicate. They just kind of kept things centrally in Cairo, and presumably even in Cairo, they also jettisoned. So that's my best guess.
But there is no Hebrew.
No Hebrew.
Thank you so much for the wonderful paper. I have a question and a comment. The question relates to the paper. Is there a difference in terms of the paper of the bifold and the rotula, so that one can be said and the other one maybe is thinner or different?
Right.
Is that the difference? And the comment just briefly, there are still moving practices like this. I'm working on Barker Benjamin. He's sewn or sewed together in his archives, his manuscript pieces.
No way.
So that is very much continuing.
Wow. Amazing. So on Egyptian paper has barely been studied at all, which is surprising because we have a lot of it. We don't even know what it was made of.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really kind of shocking. I can tell you from my, consider this an invitation. Somebody's got to do it. But I can tell you just anecdotally that the paper used for documents of state tends to be of finer quality, which is to say that the pulp is more finely ground than some of what you find for like regular everyday documents. But there is not an appreciable difference between the paper used for the bifolio and for the rotuli. It's just kind of fine paper that you would expect from the state.
Thanks, Marina. Great talk. It seems like you just talked a minute about retrieval. It seems like a nightmare to retrieve documents.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm not sure that full retrieval was really necessary. So the purpose of the little archival summary in the upper corner, I think, is exactly to spare people having to go through and kind of pull things out of it being bound. We do actually have a couple of brief mentions of going to the archive to retrieve something, and people do seem to have been able to put their hands on state archive documents with a kind of minimum of fuss and bother. So it seems to have worked for them. Physically, what this looked like, I'm still in my head on that one.
Yeah, because if you're trying to get a bifolium that's in the middle of I'm sure they didn't pack them super tight, so you could kind of, but you can't really open it
Right.
far, right? So are we imagining that they needed the document really? Would they cut the string? You could cut the string and then tie it back together or something.
They just take them off the string.
But it might be a lot. And then you have to rethread them.
I mean, I'm picturing them more like a string of lights, right? Where they're sort of far apart enough that if you actually want to see what's in the bifolia, you can
But
do
if
that.
it pierced like that, you know,
It's a candy necklace, right?
I guess you could kind of get it open like this far.
The candy necklace gets easier to eat the more candy you eat. So you just need a lot of string.
There's a lot of give in it, then you open up the space, and you can open. You only need another give to open one. Yeah.
But the Italian example, it's jammed tight.
Yeah, so the Italian example, the fates,
Those are not being used for return.
yeah, that's deep storage. That's got to be deep storage. It's like, you know, you string them tight, you tie it off, you hang it from the ceiling, and you're done.
Thank you. The etymological chestnut that one hears and relates in, the history surveys is that of like Mediterranean commercial terminology of Arabic origin, is that one of them is Czech, comes from Czech.
Right.
But now, but what you just showed me suggests that it's not specifically a letter of credit, but a generic term for file.
Yeah. Interesting. I had not actually thought about that.
So I wonder if, I don't know, I don't know who the etymologist is in question. Maybe it's Jewish or something like that. But it makes me think now that it's either a much more all-encompassing term, or at the very least that commercial documents are being stored in the same way.
Right. Right. Hence check. Yeah. I mean, so we have to check the etymology. And if it's right, then there's an article to be written, which I hope you write.
Back to that image with the central thread that's no longer there. I have a question for you on that. This is wonderful.
The thread that's
White one.
right. Yeah, I got it. Okay. Gotcha.
Is that the fold is there, but it also looks like it has two other holes that might have been, so I'm wondering if at some point they had been flattened and that, but before they had a central, they had holes the way you would have had it if it was folded. Because it looks like that hole is open or right in the middle, but it looks like there are other holes on the paper itself.
So, I mean, what I'm seeing, this I think is incidental, right? But up there, you do have those two symmetrical holes, and you can see that the string goes through there, comes out the other side.
Okay.
Right. And doesn't make it all the way.
I was looking at the other hole on
Over.
the left side.
You were looking at this one.
No, the one above, but maybe that this is the hole there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard to say.
It's hard to see. I just.
There's a long line of Arabic, on the far left edge, middle, or something. And then
That's what you mean. Yep. Right. Yeah.
Well, that's the same.
Yeah. I mean, this is also the difficult thing about working from images, that you have to decide like what's a real hole and what's not. And even if you're working with the originals, it's
a real hole.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, what's interesting is how close the holes are, the actual holes through the string through it, as opposed to the middle holes.
Right.
Can I ask you, you didn't really push this, but at the end, you were kind of going in this way, which is to say, do you want, or are you thinking of pursuing an argument that would suggest that some of this technology is learned from the Fatimids by the Italians or other Europeans, Western Europeans?
Yeah. So, right. I didn't push that. I'd have to do a lot of research to put that on like firm evidentiary ground. But I will say that circumstantially, it wouldn't surprise me, because there's a whole lot else if not from the Fatimids, then from the Mamluks. So if you look at some of the urban institutions of Mamluk, this is not my insight, this is a PhD student of mine named Lorenzo Bondioli, who says that if you look at the urban institutions of Mamluk Cairo, and then you look at the urban institutions of the Republic of Venice, the similarities are too similar for there not to have been an actual connection, right down to the terminology, right? So arsenale, right, which is darsina, or the dogana, which is the diwan, but specifically a diwan is a state bureau, but in particular one used for customs and imposts, which is how the Venetians would have encountered it in Cairo. And you can just kind of go down the list and see that there is the possibility of this kind of transfer. Whether this is an instance of it, I don't yet know.
Here, and then in the front row, and then that.
Thank you so much for this. I was wondering if there is any correlation that you observe between the type of archiving and the content of the material. And I'm thinking about those 5 villages, those documents wasn't here, but then the revenue disappeared. And then some kind of, in your opinion, some categories of information look like they're and then some others. And in relation to that, do you think some documents move to these different types of archiving? Like they arrive at the archive in unclear form, and they spend some time in the archive, perhaps in circulation, more active use, and then once there's a finitude to the information, they are here, and then kind of a stamp on the document that the use is almost done, or it enters a different phase of this slide. So I'm just wondering if you could think out loud about the life of documents in light of their content.
Absolutely. So with the decree by folio, I was in fact imagining some kind of temporal argument where when the thing is actually in active use, it's strung loosely, like we saw in the image of the scribe. And then when it's finally like put away, and no one really needs to consult it except for the little bit at the, in the corner, that's when you'd find like a tighter archiving situation, like in a codex. I think to me, that's more plausible than the belt and suspenders, like let's just do it all at the same time. And the one thing that from the evidence I've seen so far, I can't argue is that they're totally consistent about it. And this is part of the frustrating thing about working with this material, is that what you have in the long form sources is often contradicted by what you find in the documents, and even the documents don't show like a kind of consistent practice. So that's kind of why I'm still in this like mess of evidence. In terms of your first question, are certain kinds of documents, do they show evidence of, piercing while others don't? I haven't been able to find patterns yet. I mean, even the one trader I showed you lots of pierced documents from, Nahir bin Nisim, there are plenty of accounts of his that don't have the holes as well. So here too, I'm not finding consistency.
From Turkey, actually, and I listened to you, actually brought back some of the memories that I had at Kent University as a student, and while my friend, I'm focused on American history, so I never deal with the documents as much as you are doing, mostly minor texts. But one of the things that your talk made me think about, I was talking with my friends trained to be optimists, and they had those long texts, actually, right? They were studying judicial decrees, kadı defterleri, or tax ledgers, and some of them were awkwardly long, like extreme long. And when they taught me why they were shaped awkwardly, because I couldn't imagine a scribe trying to write at the bottom of the page. They told me it was actually quite suitable for their roles, because they also didn't have pockets like we had today. They had very deep pockets. So when they wanted to carry their letters, they were just slipping it in there, and they were easily carrying it around. So did you come across anything about the transportation of text? Because
nice.
are written materials meant to disseminate information.
Yeah.
So they're actually quite practical. And being a Turkish myself and knowing a little bit of them, they were very practical people too. And I guess they learned it from their neighbors in the Middle East. They're very practical, very pragmatic people. The other one is the islands. Professor Lucas Zamanyo, he wrote on it. The Mediterranean islands. Also specifically, I'm from the Mediterranean part of Turkey. And I grew up with the story like my grandfather, for fun, they were swimming to islands close to Anatolia. So islands were very important for Mediterranean people. And in Professor Zavanyo's book, he discovered that the coins printed in the same periods in Cyprus and some neighboring islands were overlapping. There were coins issued by the Muslim authorities as well as the Christian authorities in the same period of time. So he discovered they actually coexisted on the island. So the architectural transfer of knowledge you mentioned, and also their archival methods, etc. Maybe on the islands there would be more to do. Say they were also discovered into that.
Right. Yeah, I mean the locus classicus for that kind of transfer is Sicily. Because when the Normans conquered it between 1060 and 1091, they initially wrote documents in Latin, and then starting in the 1130s, they started writing documents in Arabic as well, importing Fatimid chancery experts to Sicily to kind of help them write like more impressive looking documents. Because if you were in the Mediterranean in the 12th century, like the Fatimids were kind of the state of the art for this stuff. So that would be an example of what you're talking about. On transportation of documents, the best evidence we have for that are folds. And Peter Stalybras has talked about folds. Folds are a big thing in the world of the Geniza. The frustrating thing about folds is that often you have more than one set of folds on a document, and you don't exactly know in what order they were put there. So that's one of those things like holes, where like you have to make a lot of assumptions about why they're there and what they were used for. It does seem from the regularity of many folds that you find on letters, like this is just like a tidbit that I'll leave you with, is that people wouldn't fold letters like the way we learn to do, where like you fold it in three and it's always really frustrating because like you're not always going to get like an even thirds, and then you always get a paper cut. They did something much smarter, which is that they rolled the piece of paper and then flattened it. And that's why you get these super symmetrical folds in a kind of skinny packet. And then you would write the address on the outer flap. So built-in envelope.
Can a text have different usages during its lifetime? I mean, initially it might be attached to a daftar, but the covers of the daftars were made of leather and probably were valuable and useful. Maybe they wiped out the text, I mean, the pages, and before archiving them, and they were, I don't know, like comments, they were not going to need it anytime soon. So it didn't need to be in the daftar format. They just did that afterwards. Initially, maybe they were just notebooks.
So I think it was actually the other way around more often than not. I'm just trying to find that. Nope, not that slide. I think it's the wrong presentation. Sorry. No, it was the right presentation. Yeah, you're right. Oh, I see. Okay, right. So this is an example of all the different things. So more often than not, rather than taking a daftar or a quire or a codex and dismantling it and using the paper to write documents, more often than not is the opposite, where you're taking a document and folding it and doing various things with it to build it actually into a codex. So here we see all the different things you could do with the Fatimid decree. In this case, this person has folded it into 4 to make 8 different pages for writing. In this case, for writing out a poem. This is turned 90 degrees and then reused as a document. So on the side, I'm not showing you as the beginning of the document. This is the end of the document. It's a draft of a letter. Likewise here. Okay, so this is what I wanted to show you. This is actually in the middle of a choir, where somebody took one of these Fatimid decrees and actually built it into a choir of a book, because there was so much blank space that in a pinch, that's one of the things you could do. And interestingly enough, it wasn't just like, it's not just in Hebrew manuscripts that you find these big lines of Fatimid decrees. This is a practice that persists, and you find Greek texts, you find Arabic texts, all the way up until the 15th century, that are made out of chopped up government decrees.
And let's go to Sophia, and then we'll give Peter his jump.
I have a very basic question. I'm about to respond about patterns. So it seems like you know so much about dating of the different practices. I'm struck by how specific sometimes the dates are even. Is there any sense of a kind of change over time, like that this practice only took off after a certain date, or that it declined at a certain point? I'm just wondering, because it seems like you could line up all the dates, the ones that have different patterns in the whole.
Yeah, I don't know. Change over time is incredibly complicated in the world of the Geniza, where you think you've identified a change over time, and then all of a sudden something will pop up from 2 centuries later that's exactly the same as, you know, what you thought they'd abandoned. And this happens to us all the time. So, you know, it's incredibly common in my field for people to like build these composite portraits of like 11th, 12th, 13th century practice, precisely because it's so difficult to track change over time. What the direction I thought you were going in with your question is the specificity of the dates was hugely helpful to me when I was trying to figure out what the life cycle of some of these state documents was, because there are cases, very few, but there are some cases where both the original use and the reuse are dated. And in those cases, it's always less than a decade, which I find really interesting. I mean, back to this point that I was saying in response to Jerry, where, you know, the Fatimids are kind of like running a tight ship and jettisoning things from the archives all the time. It seems that they're jettisoning things relatively quickly.
Peter, you want to unmute?
Am I unmuted or not? Okay.
Unmute.
I think he has, but maybe we haven't.
No, you should be right into the room. Hold on, Peter.
I think I'm unmuted. Is that right?
No.
Can you hear me?
Are you muted, Peter?
I'm not muted. No.
And he's just not piped into the room. Hold on.
No, I'm not muted.
All right, let's see. Speak again, Peter.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Good.
Back.
Thanks very much. That was a wonderful talk, and thank you so much for that. It was just
slowly and clearly.
so. I've got sort of 2 questions.
Now let's put it back on.
It's the crestron.
Let's put him back on here, and we'll turn it up.
Okay. I'm as loud as I can go. Shall I
speak?
shout?
You're good.
Am I good? Okay, that was really wonderful. And I've got 2 questions. The first is that, do you see any relationship between the kind of extraordinary similarities I'm seeing across a huge range of European technologies of filing? I mean, a really wide range, but being used very, very similar ones. And the Rosenbach lectures that Malaki Beit Aryeh gave many, many years ago, where he talks about the way in which scribal practices, the actual ruling systems, were shared between Christian, Jewish, and Islamic scribes. They were actually using very, very similar ruling. And I know in his case, he was really concentrating much more upon elite, rather high-level practices of annotated, sacred text, that kind of thing. But nonetheless, I just wondered whether there's a sort of something one could look at, as well as just may be just the constraints of how one uses string, but some of it I do think. So that was the first question. And the second question was, is it possible to go back to look at some of the right towards the end, you were showing bifolia, which had double holes just a little bit in from the gutter. So there were, it was there, those ones. And what, this may be completely wrong, but what they remind me of is pamphlet stitching, that, you know, there's a distinction made between, in England certainly, but I think in many countries, between pamphlets and books, and they're two different. So stab stitching is like stapling, and that when you staple, so I'm just wondering whether this isn't two pieces of string, but actually a kind of the simplest kind of binding, which would be stab stitching, as opposed to actually going through the gutter when you actually really bind a codex. So that, you know, I just wondered whether it's a possibility.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Peter. So let me take stab stitching first. I don't know if you noticed, but the title of my presentation is stab stitching, because originally in a former version, that's what I thought this was. Stab stitching or tacketing, which you also talk about in your article. I'm moving away from that because I suspect that we're not talking about a codex-like situation, but you're making me think that maybe I want to keep it in place. So thank you for that. And okay, so bringing up Malachi Beit Aryeh, great pioneer in Hebrew codicology, who made the point that Jews rule and acquire like their neighbors, right? Which is interesting because like other people have made the point that Jews bury like their neighbors. So I think, yes, Jews file like their neighbors.
That's great.
There's some comments. So Karen Reed says, Museum of Early Trades and Crafts in Madison, New Jersey has examples of a 19th century pharmacist using bill spikes to hold prescriptions. It's working for them.
Nice.
He also says, Lev, Zohar Amar, Practical Material Medica of the medieval Eastern Mediterranean, according to the Cairo Geniza, has photos of a number of prescriptions, and I can't tell if they're close to them. And some people say they're very excited and they do a great job. And then Joseph probably says, it's a very small note. There's even more great stuff related to that BGC exhibit in Dallas 2020, the Codex and Crafts in Late Antiquity, Chicago, UP. Jessica said, I'm reading the comments, it's hard to hear the room except for the speaker. Is there a way I can make this easier for me to hear?
No, Jessica.
I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing your name. I'm sorry. Pretty deep. I would imagine that copying would happen just like in modern archives of the documents, so there wouldn't be a super huge need to take the document off the string.
Is there anything in those you want to respond to?
Just one small thing on prescriptions. You know, now I just want to go through all the documents I've ever seen in my life and look for holes. Luckily, I've managed to infect one of my second-year PhD students with the obsession with holes, and so she's actually gone through quite a bit of material as well. So much that I haven't even been able to review it all for this presentation. So I suspect there's a lot more to be found, and we can maybe do like a typology of holes or something.
I mean, one of the big questions that your project raises, especially when you're talking about the Roman comparison or the differences from the Roman situation, is kind of like, what does this technology let them do, right? That other regimes with other systems, you know, or without this system, like, don't do. And that's like a huge, obviously, and that's not where you're at right now. It probably requires like a multi-team comparison of, filing systems. But it's just what I kept thinking of is kind of like, what does the string system, especially because the way you narrated it, which I love, which was kind of this, there's always more to see in these documents. I go back to that, right? But once we realize that this is how they're filing, as opposed to bundle, maybe the bundle, right, which the other account has. What's the difference between piercing and bundling?
Yeah.
At the macro level, like as far as running your state, maybe there isn't one.
Right.
Right. But
yeah, I mean, I can't give you a responsible answer now, but I can say one thing that you're making me think of. So when I read and reread and reread and reread Ibn Asaydafi's description of the Fatimid Chancery, I mean, there are a couple of things about the work that are really interesting. One is like he really goes down the whole hierarchy and describes all the different positions and what they do, and he's very detailed about it. On the other hand, you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt, because he's writing when the vizier has just basically, like the current vizier is like he's like a megalomaniac, and Ibn Asaydafi is trying to keep his job. And he's trying to keep his job in two ways. One is by saying, look what a tight ship I'm running. And the other one is by saying, look how much work we're doing. We clearly need more employees. Typical thing that like department chairs do, right? But when I finally tried to like picture, okay, so how many people are we really talking about? Like I have documents from the exact period during which Ibn Asaydafi was directing the Fatimid Chancery. And I can see that like he describes there's one calligrapher writing these fancy rotuli. But when I actually kind of lined up all the different rotuli fragments that I have from that period, I can see that there's definitely more than one calligrapher working. And given that the calligrapher, according to Ibn Asaydafi, is supposed to be like the dude with the most amazing handwriting in the realm, like there are a lot of them. So I suddenly began to picture like not a scriptorium, but like a newsroom with just like, hustle and bustle and stuff going on everywhere. So it could be that there's an enormous amount of paper that's being like shuffled and flying, and that this was kind of like, who has time to bind things into a codex? You're just going to stab it and kind of hope that things like, stay more or less where they're supposed to be.
This is fantastic development. I had a question about sort of archival practice. The copying reminded me of are there examples from the Geniza or even in later practice of like you talk about registers? They're just abstract. It's sort of like a later technology that people begin throwing right the original and keeping the abstracted bits without all the usual formularies like the names, dates, and amounts.
There, we do have registers. In fact, in this exact kind of size of bifolio, the like 15 by 27 or whatever it was, but more or less same measurements, there is a series of abstracts of orders of arrest. So that's something that kind of like popped up that I was like, oh, so they are actually abstracting these longer documents. Also, in the fiscal administration, you can see it because there are loads and loads of individual tax receipts that have survived, which are really fascinating for process because they're tiny, but there are like 5 hands on every single one, and so you can see them being passed around like checks and balances. Is it really the same amount of money when it gets to all these different offices? But then you see the central fiscal bifolio registers, and you can see that the sums get bigger and bigger, and they're kind of, as they get like sent up the chain, things are being aggregated. They're being aggregated at the provincial level. So there is quite a bit of kind of aggregation that goes on of these documents, but in some cases they found it important to preserve like the exact wording. I mean, in general, we don't have the same problem that you have for medieval Europe in this period, where you more often than not will find it's the cartulary problem, where you find summaries of documents as opposed to the originals. But in some cases, we actually do have summaries.
I was just wondering, I mean, kind of along the lines of what you just said about the sort of use of the system and the kind of controlling the math and the data. If there was some sort of more sort of kind of process-oriented reason for in that, maybe the scribes were paid by the number of documents that were transcribed in a day, or some mechanism like that, or different transcribers had different strings, right? And then, it would be perhaps an efficient way at the end of the day of tallying or kind of keeping track of, today we processed this many, this many decrees, and yesterday we processed this many. I mean, I'm thinking of people like something like, stonemasons in the Middle Ages putting marks on stone so that they could be paid by the we're talking about non-salary. I don't know, are the individuals salary or are they paid by?
They're salaried. I mean, to the extent that we know about officials, they seem to be salaried. But that doesn't, but what you're saying is important. The idea that different transcribers had different strings that they were responsible for transcribing, that's really interesting.
I mean, a sort of external ordering, but who was actually, I don't know.
Yeah, it could well be. And it could be that you have different calligraphers, because some calligraphers are writing decrees that are going to go to, one place and others to another place. Unclear in the current state of research, but that's an avenue to pursue.
But it does say clearly that you're gathering them by month, so that
right.
That
does some intent to regular.
Once the month is over and brush is over, you can bring them into some kind of order before you string them up together.
Yeah, interestingly, in the Bitaka, you have both the date and also the province. And El-Khashandi himself, when he's not quoting earlier people, this 15th century chancery guy, he says that the important things to note in the little like archival abstract are not just time but also space, which makes sense, right? Because these are the two dimensions that governments tend to want to control. So yeah, that's really interesting. I'm gonna keep thinking about that.
Sure, quickly. There's so much to say. Thank you. Just wanted to back to the Geniza sort of your repository of infinite sources here. So you showed us amazingly how the things that are one would have thought the fancy, longest, most elegant elite things of Rosalie are in fact the ephemeral, not such a big deal, looks good, does its thing, gets thrown away thing, and this more subtle, more easily ignored bifolia are the archival thing, right?
Right.
Then I'm just thinking, now I'm confused why there's so many thrown away in the Geniza of the archival thing. Now, part of it, I guess you were answering by saying they didn't really, it's a short-term archiving even of the archival thing.
Right.
But it still is a little bit.
Yeah.
They're still thrown away. They're keeping records incredibly diligently, and
except when they're not.
Right.
Yeah. So that's exactly right. That given the argument that I'm making that it's the rotuli that get shredded and reused, and that's what you find in the Geniza, then why do you also find the archival thing in the Geniza? The answer that I gave to Jerry earlier is they run a tight ship, they jettison. Yeah. But there's another part of the answer as well, which is the Cairo Geniza is like a big baggy term that we use as though all the stuff really came from the Ben Ezra synagogue. But if you actually look at to the extent that we can reconstruct the provenance of documents that are called Geniza documents in the collections where they live, it's actually not clear that they all really came from the Cairo Geniza. So the most recent work on this is by Rebecca Jefferson, where she wrote a whole book basically trying to like deconstruct the provenance of the Cairo Geniza. And it's pretty clear that it's a very contaminated collection. I've personally gone through the acquisitions records of the entire Geniza collection at Oxford. And it's very clear that whatever was coming into the library between 1888 and 1910 from Egypt that happened to have Hebrew writing on it, they were calling Geniza, but like, who knows where it really came from. So it could be that some of this stuff actually isn't from the Geniza.
Right, and there are tales of how like this, all these guys showing up sort of generated a market for like, take my stuff, like that.
Right, and the Geniza was sexy, so it sold. Thank you, Paul.
We have time for one or two more quick ways.
Yeah, just one more.
Both of you people.
But thank you so much for raising the question of technology, and I found your discussion of textiles paper and for the textiles and text. Really interesting, and that brought to my mind the Estonian collections of copper plates that are really here, and they are 10th century.
Right.
So I was
Great.
wondering if there are some materialities we can think of, like soft metal.
Nice.
Like it feels like textile is the right direction to go, but I think there might be some sideways when we talk about that materiality and their related technologies.
Great idea. Thank you very much.
Chinese coins, right?
Absolutely.
Held in captive buckle.
All right, now the real last question.
Thank you so much. While enjoying your book and this talk, I couldn't help but think of the other Egyptian Jewish archive from 1500 years prior, in Elephantine, where they're preserving an Achaemenid inscription in an Aramaic translation, lovingly preserving this text in their archive. And so, to return to the other archivists, the people who are reusing, recycling these documents, do we find any kind of creative interplay with the pathogenic? Do we find any vandalism? Do we find any translation? Do we find any commentary? Or is it just recycling and reuse?
Yeah, great question. So in one case, I found a Fatima decree that somebody had written on top of, like presumably to try to learn the calligraphy, which I thought was really sweet. Wish I could do that. And in another case, somebody had tried to actually erase the Arabic with not very good results, and so they just ended up like writing around it instead. And then there is circumstantial evidence that people interacted with them, in that you see Jews increasingly over the course of the 11th century using more and more of the language that state documents use. And even in some cases, translating it into like very high register Hebrew, right? Even high register, like rhymed prose in Hebrew. Rhymed prose is like a classic Arabic thing to do, but they're like, no, we're going to like be super high register and we're going to have rhymed Hebrew prose. And then every once in a while, you'll find like an actual description of people interacting with government documents. Like this one fantastic deposition that I quote in my book of this guy who's sitting around holding, he submitted a petition, presumably to like the central government in Cairo, asking for permission to be able to essentially found his own synagogue because he hated his rabbi. Classic Jewish story. And he's sitting there holding the endorsed petition because he got his it was approved. He's sitting outside his shop, and according to the deposition, his friend, and he's laughing his head off. So his friend walks by and his friend's like, why are you laughing? And he's like, look. And the guy looks at it and he's like, oh, wow. So apparently the friend like actually knew kind of what was on there. So I sort of like that, the idea that, your average Jew walking down the street would look at an endorsed petition and know actually what it was.
All right, I think we'll wrap it up there.
Thank you, guys.
I don't know if the cat center of Geniza is right and have a lot of holes.
Oh yeah, there's some good holes over here.
Time to look.